Hey there, and welcome back to another Wizarding World video. And recently, I'd been thinking about Shrek and how over the years, I'd come to realise that despite what the movies try to tell you, the real villain of the franchise is King Harold. And that despite him being largely looked on quite fondly within the source material itself, when you look at it through a clearer lens, you see that in fact, he is the worst sort of man. A bad king, a bad husband, and a bad father. You name it, he is it. Just a truly terrible man. Frog. And so that got me thinking, how many other examples of characters are there that have this sort of low-key piece of shit energy? Characters that are seemingly beloved for the most part within their respective franchise, but whose actions, from the perspective of an impartial viewer, a person who's just reading or watching along, are pretty reprehensible and very difficult to justify. And honestly, I know in the last decade or so there's been a lot of discussion about how Dumbledore's worse than you remember, but regardless, there's still that undercurrent of him being this awesome badass that sort of protects his reputation somewhat. And then there's the fact that in-universe, in the books, in the movies, and now in the prequel movies, we're constantly told to sympathise with Dumbledore over and over, to try and make him seem less bad. Whenever a character has doubts about him, there's numerous other characters around to talk about what an enormous gigachat he is. And so, his negative traits are clearly being shuffled off to the side by JK Rowling. Remember that whole pure of heart thing during the Secrets of Dumbledore? Ugh. All the questionable decisions that Dumbledore's made were just there to give him an added edge. An element of moral ambiguity. To make him not seem like an all-knowing god. But they weren't there to make him seem like an irredeemable piece of trash. But here I am today, telling you that in fact, Dumbledore is an irredeemable piece of trash. And obviously, not compared to the actual villains of the franchise, but compared to the majority of other characters, he is in fact a turd. And so, let's start from the beginning. Now obviously, we don't know all that much about Dumbledore's early life. We know his sister was attacked, which left her mentally traumatized, and eventually led to her turning into an obscurus. We know his father died in prison after attacking the perpetrators. We know he was well liked at school, that he was sorted into Gryffindor, and he was well thought of by teachers and was pegged as a future Minister of Magic. So that's all well and good, right? Well, it's not good, but it's a good backstory. And there's nothing that suggests he's a bad person from those early years. Until the death of his mother, and then he meets Grindelwald whilst he's caring for his sister in Godric's Hollow. And this is where our tale truly begins, as suddenly, the mask drops off, and he develops a fundamentalist wizarding doctrine that outlines how wizards are an inherently superior form of life, and they need to move forward to subjugate muggles, because it's for their own good, the greater good. All muggles are inherently violent and savage. They need a firm guiding hand to rule over them and ensure the prosperity of the planet. The same sort of shit that every evil ethnic cleansing dictator ever started out spouting. So in this little phase of his life, in just a couple of months, he becomes a borderline terrorist, or at least plans to become one. And he makes plans to overthrow wizarding governments, probably using force, and to establish a whole group of people, non-magicals, as a lesser form of life. All the while neglecting his family, and then planning to abandon his family. Or at worst, get his disabled sister to trek around the world as they spurt their propaganda and develop their insurgent army. He even goes so far as to make a blood pact with the other lead terrorists to be a symbol of their love and ensure they can never betray one another. So he was all in on killing the muggles at this point. And yes, I suppose you could argue that he's had a hard life and a reason to hate muggles, but to me that feels like excuses. You don't forgive a racist or a homophobe or a transphobe or whatever sort of bigotry just because they've had a bad experience with that group. You wouldn't say to Bob the loner who got bullied at school that it was okay that he'd made plans to shoot up the school cafeteria, but the FBI noticed his online activity just in time. Since he didn't do it, it's not bad, right? Just because he didn't end up doing anything wrong doesn't make him a good person. He still planned this monstrous thing, and nobody would ever want to talk to him again if they found out. You wouldn't try to say, oh, he was young, he didn't know what he was doing, like they do for Albus in the book. So it's the same deal with Albus for me. I can't even imagine ever doing something like that. And then on top of that, this then leads into his sister's death, which in the initial book canon is only slightly his fault. He was planning on leaving with Grindelwald, which pissed Aberforth off, and then a fight started between Aberforth and Grindelwald, with Albus then getting involved. But in the new film canon, Secrets of Dumbledore, he is the one who attacks Aberforth after Aberforth draws his wand. So it was the brothers who started the fight whilst Grindelwald was laughing and didn't do anything. And then this duel resulted in Ariana's death. So that's another black mark on his record, although I'd argue that this is also Aberforth's fault. But after these terrible events, maybe he's going to be alright. Maybe he'll reform his life and improve upon himself as a person. Except he doesn't. It's just more of the same, except it's not as nefarious. But it's still pretty awful stuff. Okay, throughout the books, whenever we hear about Grindelwald and Dumbledore, we always hear that Dumbledore waited until 1945 to finally confront Grindelwald, wizard to wizard, and take him down. And in Crimes of Grindelwald, they hint that this is because he in fact had a blood pact, a pact that made him incapable of actually fighting him, and thus, Grindelwald was able to conduct his reign of terror unchecked in continental Europe, whilst Dumbledore was desperately scrambling to try and find a way to break the damn thing. And I thought this was actually a clever way to explain why the hell he would just let the monster he helped create rampage and kill his way across Europe without doing jack shit to help. But no, now it just looks like he was probably too in love with him to fight him. Seriously, who the hell could stay in love with a person like this? And so since he was too in love, he didn't do anything until he basically had no alternative, until people were begging him to save them. It makes him seem like an awfully selfish sort of person. Like, dude, go fight. People are dying. Help them. Jesus. And then there's even more. So let's wind back the clock to when he meets Voldemort for the first time. And okay, I get the kid was clearly a bit disturbed even then. He heard about how he'd hurt people, etc., etc. But at the same time, I can't help but think he was a bit too openly stern and scornful towards a damaged child. Hell, when he's talking to Harry, he seems like he's very sympathetic to Tom's early life. But that he was always suspicious, always watching, never really all that warm towards him. Which is very different to how he behaves towards even the most wretched of bullies during Harry's time. He's even dismissive of Snape's actions, despite him bullying literal children. But he can't extend any sort of helping hand towards an orphan that could use a wise authority figure to at least try and bring him down the right path. He essentially abandons this child to his fate. And I know he was a creepy kid and was probably always destined for this dark path because, plot reasons and also the incest genetics. But part of me feels like this is a bit of a young Anakin situation. And even if it wasn't, even if he couldn't bring him to the light, he at the very least could have used his bare minimum knowledge to stop some serious atrocities that Tom commits during and after he leaves the school. Because he knew that Voldemort was a Parselmouth, and he knew that the Chamber of Secrets had opened and that the heir of Slytherin had returned, that the heir would likely speak Parseltongue, because, that's like the Slytherin's whole thing, come on. And even if he wanted to just make sure, it couldn't have taken too much investigation to find out who his mum was, as Voldemort successfully does this. When he's in school, with school resources, he manages to figure it out. And then after the whole Chamber of Secrets episode, where he kills students, petrifies other students, and frames Hagrid, seriously, an acromantula, who's going to believe that? Why didn't Dumbledore, a man so smart that he discovered 12 uses for dragon's blood, even remotely consider that the boy who can talk to snakes might have something to do with the Snake House chamber being opened? It's not bloody Sherlock Holmes level detective work, mate. Shouldn't Dumbledore at the very least reveal what he knew, even before then as a sort of side note on his student file? That, by the way, this new orphan kid, he can talk to snakes. It's a special magical ability. I feel like that's something the school's body should be aware of. Even if this wasn't the case, couldn't he have just told the authorities? That feels like a duty of care moment. Or did this teenager somehow have plants in the ministry already? And Dumbledore, the man who was heralded to be a future minister of magic when he was in school, and now in law was the Chillin's first choice to be the supreme mugwump, an act that everyone would have seen televised around the world somehow, was too weak against Tom Riddle's political power? Really? He could have prevented this. Oh, and what about when the Muggles named Riddle, die, and then the only living Gaunt confesses and is off to prison? Oh, and look, and Tom's back at school, and now he has a fancy new ring. And this is the Resurrection Stone ring, right? So wouldn't Dumbledore have noticed? The man who was obsessed with the Deathly Hallows as a teenager didn't recognize it, despite having frequent contact with this student? Are you telling me that Dumbledore never looked at Tom's hand again after this incident? So far, we have Dumbledore birthing a terrorist ideology, accidentally killing his sister, selfishly avoiding fighting Grindelwald for several years for no good reason, and now he's bungled Voldemort's school years, creating the second darkest wizard ever. And you're telling me that this is the guy that is apparently pure of heart. Pfft, wow. But anyway, as is tradition for enabler Albus Dumbledore, despite being 99% sure that he had attempted to murder several students and had murdered his own family, he doesn't say anything as he graduates and goes off into the world scot-free. And he waits, another 25 years to actually start doing something about him? But yeah, so apart from seemingly recruiting kids right out of school to fight a war for you, and all the previous stuff I mentioned, the First Wizarding War isn't really something I can fault him for. He just has that World War I mentality, I get it, he's an old man. He wouldn't think drafting these kids into a war is all that big a deal, I guess. But it's more his actions after the war that really burnt my biscuits. Because right after Harry's parents are murdered, he justifies leaving him with people whom his trusted second-in-command calls the worst sort of muggles imaginable. And I mean, it's been what, a couple of days? He couldn't possibly just wait and see to see if they were actually terrible people himself? He truly believes that there's no other choice than putting this 1-year-old into an abusive family home? That's better than growing up famous? He has to have known what kind of people they were. Either that or he's just not nearly as intelligent as people give him credit for. Again, this is the guy that has such empathy that he's pure of heart. And if he wasn't aware and thought McGonagall, the poster woman for not exaggerating, was exaggerating, he didn't think to at least have someone check up on the kid whose family's demise led to peace within the Wizarding World for 10 years, something that he himself could not reap the rewards from? No one to drop in and see how he's doing? I mean, at what age do you reckon the Dursleys started locking him in the cupboard? I'm gonna guess it's from the first time he started crying. But it never should have gotten to that point. If he'd done his due diligence instead of dumping a baby on a front doorstep like an animal at a rescue centre, he may very well have been able to find some long-lost cousin that the blood protection could have worked with. Are you actually going to tell me that all of Lily's extended family are conveniently dead? There's no cousins, no uncles, no aunts? Everybody is gone. Okay. But why couldn't he stay at Hogwarts? He's literally protected there every time he visits, and there's house elves to look after him. I know it's not ideal, but it's better than getting abused. Almost more than anything else, to me this proves Dumbledore's just a bastard. Because then when he finds out that they're neglectful at best, abusive at worst, he forces him to go back every year. Fuck off, Dumbledore. There's no chance that the Weasleys wouldn't immediately put their house under the Fidelius charm for Harry's sake. It's like, why do you want him to suffer? I guess somebody could try and assassinate him in Diagon Alley or something, but considering he almost dies every year at school, I feel like this is a chance you can realistically take. I mean, he's aware of the whole Aunt Marge fiasco, and yet he lets him stay at Diagon Alley for 3 weeks unsupervised. Unless you count Tom the bartender as adequate supervision. So clearly there's no problem, and he's just a bit of an asshole. Seriously, you'd think after making the fatal error of neglecting the welfare of a previous orphan who was in an isolated upbringing and turned out to be a mass murderer, you'd try to make sure that the next orphan you're in charge of would have the best support he could get. Jesus, he's lucky that Harry didn't reject the Wizarding World completely for abandoning him and turn into Tom Riddle 2.0, or even just the previous examples of his sister and his nephew. 2 children whose magical ties were broken and negatively impacted and turned into Obscurials. Albus has absolutely zero foresight and just got really lucky that Harry's a really strong-willed kid. And then there's the whole, let's let Snape bully and abuse children for over a decade thing. Did he really need him to be an employee at Hogwarts? He could have kept an eye on him from anywhere. Not to mention, he sets a trap for a potentially dangerous wizard to try and steal the Philosopher's Stone in a school when children are there. And then he thinks it's fine to leave the school knowing that who you're baiting would take any possible chance to succeed when you're not there. And on top of that, the next year, he doesn't inform anybody that the heir of Slytherin has to be Voldemort, or at least it has to be a relative of Voldemort. Which means that Harry gets severely bullied, and Hagrid gets arrested and chucked in with the Dementors. The next year, despite him collecting people's memories for years, including memories of inmates at Azkaban for his vendetta against Voldemort, he never once visits Sirius Black to get his side of the story, despite him being a trusted lieutenant of the Dark Lord. The next year after that, he lets a child compete in an adult wizarding tournament in which people can die, literally using him as bait on top of ridiculous magical tasks for Voldemort to mess up and reveal himself. Because, greater good and all that. Surely there's no rule against Harry just turning up and forfeiting each challenge. That feels like it's technically within the rules. He should have been forced to do that. And then we come to the 5th book, where he just ignores Harry for a year. A year! And all because he's worried that Voldemort's going to read his mind. But you know what? Why not just tell Harry that you're worried that Voldemort's going to read his mind? That way, he doesn't have to worry that you hate him or some shit, or that you don't care. Maybe that would also allow him to focus more on occlumency lessons because it would mean that afterwards, he's allowed to be involved. Also, on top of that, maybe try teaching him. He's the most important piece on your chessboard. Take care of him better. Don't give him to Snape, who openly hates him. Do it yourself. Seriously. At this point in his life, where he literally is getting possessed regularly by an evil wizard, Harry needs kind guidance and reassurance that it's all going to work out well. Not Snape yelling about how his dad was a bully almost 20 years ago and that he's glad he's dead. But you know, Dumbledore says sorry at the end, so it's all okay. And then we come to the 6th one, where he knows for a fact he is dying and he just doesn't explain jack shit, with the expectation that Harry is going to decide to commit assisted suicide, with only a theoretical chance that he might survive. Seriously, this hasn't happened before, so he has no evidence. What a bastard. And yet the story tries to frame this man as a gift from God, the greatest of all time, the purest of heart. And once upon a time, I probably did believe that. As a child, you're fooled into viewing this man like Harry does, as a wise elderly grandfather figure. But now he just reeks of criminal negligence, unnecessary cruelty, and selfishness, and kind of stupidity. And it's unfathomable how he uses a child to his best interest with no concern about how he can give him a good life, even though he knows he has to sacrifice him at the end. You're supposed to treat the sacrificial lamb nice. But anyway, with all that being said, these are just my opinions and now I'd like to hear yours. What do you think of Dumbledore? You like him? You hate him? Do you understand him? I'm curious for your thoughts, so make sure to like, comment, and subscribe and let me know.